Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer, Professor of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I'll be the host for our program today. Joining me are two regulars. On my left is Don Cooney. Don is a professor in the School of Social Work at Western Michigan University, and he's also the Vice Mayor of the City of Kalamazoo. Does double duty most days, right? And also is Denise Keel with us today again, and Denise has recently joined the program. We're so happy that she's with us. Denise is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Western Michigan University, and she also works at the Institute for the Environment and Sustainability.
Close.
Did I get it right?
But that's,
Institute
we can get the English grammatical people on here to talk about it just means of and for one day. Yeah.
Institute
It was a big
of
debate.
the Environment and Sustainability. Well, it's a very important program on our campus, and it has gone through this name change to give it greater visibility, I think, on our campus,
exactly
and the folks over there, including you, do great work. Denise also is the chair of our working group on climate change at Western Michigan University. She's just fresh back from a sabbatical, so she's all geared up and ready to go.
That's right.
Well, it's been about a month since we taped our last program. And has anything been going on?
Has anything happened while we were away?
So let's see, what's been happening?
August is usually a slow news cycle, too, is what's so interesting.
We've had two 500-year monstrous hurricanes, right? Harvey and Irma. As we tape this program, Irma is roaring through the Caribbean and approaching Florida, so we still don't know the impact of the storm on Florida, but that's obviously one of the big stories, and we want to talk a little bit about that today. There's that country over there in Asia, North Korea.
Oh, I heard it.
They tested some more ICBMs and perhaps a hydrogen bomb.
Wow.
And so the relationship there has become quite tense again. And so, the threat of war on the Korean Peninsula is looming. It depends how our government, I think, responds to that and whether we can move forward with diplomacy. The Trump administration decided that, the Afghanistan war was a good idea and they were going to double down on it. And so we're going to send more troops, apparently, another surge. Storm surge is not the only kind of surge we're going to be talking about. So that's happening. The Trump administration decided to undercut a lot of people who were immigrants to this country, who were called the Dreamers, the DACA program. And so that apparently is going to be phased out, or maybe not. We don't know. The president's most recent tweet seems to suggest he's backing off on that a little bit. Also, we had Nazis and Ku Klux Klan and white supremacists marching in Charlottesville, Virginia. The President of the United States couldn't quite bring himself to condemn that unequivocally without also saying, well, there's some blame on the other side, and there's some good people out there marching. And I know, Don, you want to get back and talk a little bit more about that. The President also pardoned a racist sheriff who had broken the law on many occasions and was being held in contempt of court out in Phoenix, Arizona, Joe Aparo. And boy, not much has been happening at the end of the summer.
Today,
It's been
How long's our
quiet,
program?
Exactly.
So there's a lot to talk about. I think we can start perhaps by talking about the two massive hurricanes.
Yes.
Those are very recent. People in Houston are still struggling to recover from the devastating impact of Harvey, which produced just incredible amounts of rain, flooded a city that's prone to flooding anyhow. And so a number of issues, I think, can be addressed there. Again, as we speak, Hurricane Irma is approaching Florida. It's right now called the strongest Atlantic hurricane ever. The winds were at one point 185 mile per hour sustained. I think it's dropped slightly, but still the projected path takes it right up over the peninsula of Florida. And if the eye of the storm approaches Miami, it could be some incredible devastation there. So people are evacuating from Florida as we speak. So the question I have, Denise, for you is, does climate change have anything to do with these 500-year hurricane events that have taken place within 1 week of each other?
Absolutely, there's no moral equivalency here, okay? Yes, climate change has a lot to do with what we're seeing right now. I wish this was a little bit more reported in the mainstream
Yes.
media,
Yes.
so I'm glad that we're here to offer this alternative view today. Absolutely, any good scientist will tell you that they cannot link this particular hurricane to climate change. But what we do know from the climate science is that these are the types of events that we ought to be expecting now at this level, that climate change increases the risk and hazard of extreme weather events. And I would just like to remind everybody, a year ago we would have been talking about Texas in the worst drought ever recorded, off the chart of the scale that we record droughts in. And this year we're talking about unprecedented rainfall, right? So this is what climate change does. It has warmer water, which it makes stronger storms. And I had to write down the water was 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit above an average storm. So you see, and then it sits over Houston, right, because of that basin, and drops this unprecedented rainfall. And it's really, again, kind of sad to me that we're not talking about the source of these greater storms more often. And now we've got another one rolling up to hit Miami, and Trump seems to be excited in his tweets that these are the biggest storms ever, exclamation point. Well, why are they the biggest storms ever? And we really need to be focusing on climate change as the source, not just the effects, important stuff, right, to deal with the effects of these hurricanes and the folks that are hurt by them, but let's deal with the source of the problem.
Yeah, and it seems like the president is going the exact opposite way. He just gave a speech in North Dakota this week, bragging about how now these pipelines are open, which are going to bring the tar sands oil into the country, and he also bragged about we're out of this Paris Accord, which would have been horrendous. So we're running full speed ahead in the wrong direction.
That's exactly right. 350.org, which is an organization started by Bill McKibben, one of the founding climate activists, a couple years, well, maybe more like 3 or 4 years ago, they had a pledge to name hurricanes. Instead of naming them after nice people like Harvey and Irma, that they ought to name them after senators and representatives who were opposing climate change at the time. And
Great idea.
And
or
now,
maybe corporations.
And now they're saying
ExxonMobil
you
hurricane.
are exactly right. Today they were posting that they want to name them Exxon and Chevron, and to make this link, right? We still have this problem where we're not making the link between a natural disaster and the effects of human impacts of climate change that make those disasters worse, right? And so I started calling them fossil fuel events, right? So
I like it.
Yes, exactly.
Fossil fueled events.
That's
Yeah,
right.
George Monbiot, who's an excellent columnist for The Guardian in the UK, had a column last week. The headline, "Why are the crucial questions about Hurricane Harvey not being asked?"
Exactly.
Now, he certainly takes to task the Trump administration and those who are climate deniers, but he also points the finger at the media.
Yes.
Because why isn't the media talking about
Exactly.
this? And you have to look very, very hard to find almost any reporting on the issue of climate. He actually uses the term climate breakdown.
Yes.
Climate change sounds pretty mild.
It
Climate
does.
breakdown, climate chaos
That's right.
is really what we're experiencing. And so he's pointing his finger at the media. Why aren't we talking about this? Why don't we make the connections?
Exactly.
Now, of course, we need to point out hurricanes have always existed,
That's
right?
right.
Hurricanes are going to happen. That's not the issue.
That's right.
We're not saying that climate change or global warming
Caused
causes
hurricanes. No,
Hurricanes
exactly.
occur. But here's the point that you were making.
Right.
When hurricanes develop now, as they always have, they're going to be stronger. They're going to be more intense.
right.
The effects are going to be exacerbated. The warmer waters of the ocean, the warmer waters of the Gulf of Mexico fuel these.
right.
I mean, as Harvey moved closer to Houston, as it was moving across the warmer waters of the Gulf, it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. That normally wouldn't happen.
That's right.
As it approached landfall, it normally would have decreased in intensity, but because of the warmer waters of the Gulf, it increased in intensity.
That's right.
The same with the Atlantic. much warmer than normal, fueling Irma. And the warmer waters also mean that more water gets evaporated, and we have more water vapor, more moisture in the air, which leads to more intense rainfall then.
Yeah.
And so it's a double whammy. And then there are also plenty of scientists who argue that climate change is causing some alterations in the jet stream and allowing for certain high pressure systems to come and block. Part of the reason Harvey was so devastating is because it just sat there for days on end, drenching Texas, and it wasn't moving because of some of the alterations in the jet stream, and there was a big high pressure ridge blocking it from moving. So these are the kinds of things, and I think we need to point out these things have been predicted.
That's right.
James Hansen, in his book, which he wrote, what, 10 years ago now, over 10 years ago, Storms of My Grandchildren. I mean, the basic point was climate change is going to cause storms in the future to be more intense, more devastating, and my grandchildren will be put at greater risk because of these kinds of storms. That's why we need to do something about climate change. And of course, James Hansen first testified to Congress back in the 1980s about this. And that's the point, that we've known about this for a long time. This is not a surprise.
No, no one should be surprised.
No one should be surprised in the least
rainfall.
that this is happening.
That's right.
This is exactly what has been predicted.
That's right.
And it's just, you know, not astounding, but it's just, oh, I mean,
the disconnect is really frustrating.
It is.
To know that this is what's happening, and you know, there's some blame on the administration, to be sure, and past administrations. There's some blame for the media. You know, the people who do get it are the actuaries and the flood insurance folks.
Exactly.
And so, you know, one of the things that is changing because of this, one of the stories I find so interesting, you know, we say, oh, a 500-year or 1,000-year flood event. Well, to a normal person, that means, oh, this isn't going to happen again for another 500 years, and it reinforces this natural kind of component. The most recent U.S. National Climate Assessment is changing those ratios. So what a 500-year flood means is the likelihood of that happening, right, is 1 in 500 for any given year. And they're going to have to change those numbers. The actuaries, the folks who do insurance know that the risk is increasing. That's why flood insurance is such a mess. No one wants to actually insure people because the risk is getting greater. And maybe it's those kind of economics that will bring home to homeowners and to cities and to developers that, wow, we can't build here. We can't insure this property against these risks. But that's still, you know, a ways off. I would say the one story that is leading us there, several news outlets did talk about urbanization and the lack of zoning in Houston as an effect, right, after, as to talk about how the water ran off and where it went and how long that took. Because of some overdevelopment and urbanization. Right, Texas is famous for no zoning. You're not going to tell us where to put nothing, right? The very American private property right.
We don't want government interfering with our lives.
We don't want government interfering with our lives.
We don't need no stinking government, right?
Exactly.
Right.
So a lot of folks have talked about urbanization in the cleanup efforts and in how the storm surge went down. But again, we're not getting at that source. Why was this storm so much more destructive, and what is the real risk? And those things are starting to change, and maybe there'll be an economic wake-up call in the insurance industry of homeowners, for sure.
Yeah, and thank goodness for some of the alternative press. Like
Absolutely.
Democracy Now!, they had Bill McKibben on. She had Bill McKibben on for, and others on there too, that really laid it out, but not in the mainstream press. You know, whenever we have a development in the city, they have to show us, what are you going to do about your stormwater? And they're not going to get a permit until they show us how that is going to be cared for. But in Houston, it's just, go ahead, wherever you want to go. Don't even ask us, just go do it. To me, the bottom line is, we don't have to worry about nature. We can just do whatever we want, but this shows us in many ways that we have to deal with living with nature and not violating.
Living with a nature.
You know, one of the points I bring up in my classes is we always call these natural disasters. Well, the disaster is pretty human, actually,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right, yeah. That's very true.
And I sense the frustration and anger of climate change activists growing
Absolutely.
as these things unfold and we see the suffering, the human suffering
That's right.
taking
Gee.
place in
That-
Houston
Wow.
and that we're likely to see happen in Florida over the next couple of days.
Absolutely.
Mark Hertzgaard is a journalist who writes for The Nation magazine. And he's not what I would call a super radical, and he wrote a great book called Hot.
Yeah.
He got into this whole business because of his daughter. He was so concerned about the future of his daughter. And he's been writing about climate change on a regular basis for The Nation. And a couple of years ago, he wrote, "To refuse to act against global warming is to condemn thousands of people to death and suffering today and millions more tomorrow. This is murder. Even if Trump's willful ignorance of climate science prevents him from seeing." He wrote that a year ago. And so today he came back and said, this is premeditated murder. That's pretty strong language.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, as a
Wow.
criminologist, I'm always
Yeah,
interested in
yeah.
people using the language of crime and criminality to talk about climate change. Here it is.
Yep.
He also says it's past time to call out Trump and all climate deniers for this crime against humanity. No more treating climate denial like an honest difference of opinion.
Right.
When top tobacco executives swore to Congress back in the day that nicotine wasn't addictive, their
right.
assertion, though laughable, did not make it true. 46 attorney generals forced those companies to pay billions of dollars for their wickedness. Now, he says, the individuals and institutions pushing climate denial must be called out with even greater vigor in newspaper columns, on TV and radio talk shows. Here we are.
Wow.
In
That's
town
right.
halls, at the ballot box, and by consumer boycotts, legal investigations, shareholder resolutions, street protests, and more. So you can really sense that those who have been most active in this movement are getting increasingly frustrated. And the language that they're using grows stronger and stronger to try to condemn the horror that we're
right.
witnessing. And
Yeah.
so again, people fall back on the language of crime to talk about that. And Mark Hertzgaard is certainly one of them, is doing that.
Yeah.
It was nice to see Al Franken in the Senate calling out some of the colleagues on exactly that. That you
Good.
know, so we still need this debate, and why don't we have a red team, green, you know, that whole. And Al Franken said, "No, that's what science already did.
Yeah.
What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
It was a great quote, and that's, you know, in every single public arena, that's what we all have to be saying now. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So-
And the idea that there's somehow still disagreement among scientists is just completely ridiculous.
Yep.
There is no disagreement. So normally that figure, 97 to 98% of climate
Yes.
scientists, is quoted. Well, Naomi Oreskes and some others went back or it wasn't Naomi, it was another group of scientists. They went back and said, well, what about those few papers that have been published that seem to show something different? And they went back and tried to replicate them. They couldn't.
They couldn't.
They couldn't replicate them. There
Yep.
were so many errors of interpretation and mistaken assumptions and
That's right.
fudging of the timeline in which they looked at
Yep.
events. They ended up concluding these papers are laughable in the sense that they don't really dispute the
yeah.
basic science. And so,
Yeah.
you know, that consensus among the scientific community that this is happening,
That's right.
that it's real, it's human cause, it's caused by greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, that case has never, ever been
No.
stronger. And given, I mean, and that case has been there for
a long
30
time.
years.
Yeah.
However, we have seen another kind of crime that I call the crime of political omission, right? That is, governments have failed to do what
Yes.
they're morally and legally required to do,
Yes.
which is to protect us, to protect the
right.
commons, to
all.
respond to these,
That's right.
that they're not natural disasters, they're disasters caused by
humans.
certain kinds of human activities,
Right.
particularly by certain corporate activities in the fossil fuel industry, right? And so we really need to name those that are responsible. And there's plenty of research that shows that there's a relatively small number of corporate and state
That's right.
organizations that are responsible for the massive amount of greenhouse gas emissions. We can actually pinpoint
There's a new
exactly who is
study.
responsible.
Exactly. There's a new study out exactly on what you're talking about to quantify the actual costs. Now, it's economic, of course, of the top 90 fossil fuel companies in the world. And this study says they're responsible for at least half of the kind of economic devastation we just saw in Harvey. And that's an important point, though, Ron, as you know, when we're talking about policy and legality of crime, right? I mean, how do we explain this disconnect between the science and the policy? Well, policy is about winners and losers.
Sure.
Right?
Right. It's choices.
And it's choices. And who won? Exxon and Mobil and the folks who took their money, right? Well, who lost? All of these victims that we're seeing on TV today and will continue to see. I think that is the choice that has been made. And we're on, in some avenues with activists, on track to maybe change that legally as well. People are suing because of these damages. Right? And our court system isn't set up very well to handle big public disasters on an individual court basis, right? But studies like this that show that correlation will be used in court to say, no, we can show that Exxon is responsible for 50% of our damages, pay out, right?
Yeah. So what chance do we have to move on that when he appoints as his Secretary of State a guy who spent his whole career with Exxon? It's just, and the other thing that bothers me deeply is what you were talking about, Ron, the murder thing. It's not just us that's being hurt. It's the whole world that's being hurt by our failure to act on this. And then our withdrawal from the Paris Accords isolates us from the very positive things that are being done in other countries around the world that we could learn from and implement here. So that isolationist thing tremendously hurts our people, but also hurts the rest of the world. And there's a responsibility here.
There is.
As we were focusing on Houston, 41 million people over in the Himalayan lowlands were being affected by massive monsoon rains that were causing tremendous flooding over there. Bangladesh. And Bangladesh has often been cited as a nation that tremendous risk for sea level rise and for monsoon rain precipitation like we've seen, and of course for cyclones, striking them. They are tremendously at risk. And of course, right now, while we were focused on our more locally what's happening in the U.S., there was tremendous suffering and flooding going on over in South Asia, and we can't ignore that. That's exactly the point you're making, Don, I think.
And I think what you said earlier, at one point, it's going to come that, hey, we can't afford
this.
We can't afford this because look at this, one right after the other. Houston, Miami, and now there'll be more. And money talks to these people. And at some point, they're going to have to say, you know what, maybe we got to find a different way.
Maybe it's not, the easier thing to a $15 billion aid package at the end of an event. What would be the difference in the cost-benefit analysis if we spent some money to get ourselves ready for infrastructure and adaptation and mitigation of climate change to stop, so we don't have to pay $15 billion on the end?
And it might be 150 billion by the time they're done, right?
I used to always make this argument with regard to crime control. The old Fram oil filter commercial, if you remember that, the greasy mechanic holding up a Fram oil filter says, you can pay me now or you can pay me later. You can put a $20 Fram oil filter in your car or I can rebuild your engine at a cost of $2,000 later on.
It's true. This principle holds.
The principle holds here.
Man.
And so what's interesting to me is that this really can focus our attention on the ideological debate about the role of government, right?
Yes.
Because what is the proper role of government here? The children that are suing the federal government out in Oregon in federal district court are basically saying, you guys have a legal and moral responsibility to protect the commons, to protect nature's trust. And you haven't done it, and we're suing you to make you do it. And of course, the argument, I think, why so many people are deniers in the first place is because they do clearly see the implications that if we agree that climate change is real and we're going to do something about it, it requires massive government programs and investments and actions. And to that effect, Christian Parente, who, by the way, is coming to Kalamazoo in November. I think November 2nd will be the lecture from Christian Parente, who's a sociologist and journalist. He writes for The Nation magazine. He's written an excellent book called Tropic of Chaos, which I hope everybody gets a chance to read. But in an article in The Nation, and this was 5 years ago, he wrote this article. The title of the article is Why Climate Change Will Make You Love Big Government. Why climate change? And here's just one of the final paragraphs. He says, to adapt to climate change will mean coming together on a large scale and mobilizing society's full range of resources. In other words, big storms, can you say Harvey and Irma, require big government. Who else will save stranded climate refugees or protect and rebuild infrastructure or coordinate rescue efforts and plan out the flow and allocation of resources? It will be government that does these tasks or they will not be done at all. And of course, if they're not done at all, even more people suffer. And so what do we see? Right after Harvey, we see a changed tone in Washington, D.C., don't we? All of a sudden, the debt limit is going to be that's going to be whisked right through.
No problem.
They're going to be raised, no problem. We're not going to shut down the government. And on top of that, what are we going to do? $15 billion is going to be allocated. And again, that's a drop in the bucket for what Texas needs. But $15 billion from the federal government. Now, if Irma strikes Florida in the way that's being predicted, it's going to double the cost of what happened in Houston. Take all the billions of dollars in cost in Houston and double it. Irma's going to be very devastating for Florida. Is the government going to come up with more money? And then they will.
Of course they will.
They better. They better, or you know, they'll be held to pay, I think, in the Congress. But so again, this is going to keep happening. These storms are not going to stop. And so every time there's a storm, we're going to have to, okay, we got to take care of the damage. Let's pony up the money to do it. Again, climate change will make you love big government if you're the victim. But now let's be smart about this. Let's think ahead. And wouldn't it be better if we prevented Harveys and Irmas from getting as strong as they are and doing the devastation? And of course, for all the other reasons why we need to react to climate breakdown. There's so many other crimes that are occurring, harms that are occurring as a result of climate breakdown that we need to see some response.
Well, it was very interesting to see the conversion of the senators from Texas. Ted Cruz was so against giving the money to New York, but then all of a sudden he saw, I think I should intervene here. All of a sudden, So, I mean, it's such an act. You know, it's not based on principle. It's just based on selfishness.
And it's got to move from this part of it that, okay, yes, once the disaster occurs, government has to step in and clean up the mess. But now let's think about, you know, being
it can't
proactive,
always be
being preventive.
Reactive emergency fund that is at the 11th hour for these things. We, like you said before, I think one of the important points is we know this is going to happen and continue to happen. What are we doing about it, and what policy choices are we actually making?
And this brings us right back to the Trump administration appointing climate denialists to key positions in the Environmental Protection Agency, the Secretary of State, Energy, on and on and on, withdrawing from the Paris Accords, advocating that we build those pipelines and that we go all in on fossil fuel development. I mean, these are exactly the wrong things to do. These are crimes. These are crimes of continuing to extract fossil fuels and allow them to be marketed and burned and throwing up even more greenhouse gas emissions into the air. These are exactly the wrong things that have to happen. So we've got to shift our attention. Once we take care of the people in Texas and Florida, provide the money they need to help rebuild to some extent, we've got to then focus on, hey, we got to address these other policies of the federal government.
There's a larger parallel here from my world of environmental politics. You know, classic question of government is what is the role, right? What's the function of government supposed to do? And this is how we got all the environmental laws that were passed in the late 1960s, early 1970s, because of the effects because of the human health problems, because of a lot of lawsuits and trying to link cancers and other things to pesticides at that time, and mostly because of this commons issue that we're really talking about. It doesn't just affect me right here, or when it does affect me, I want my money. That means I have to be willing to help others. And that's what we mean by the commons, right? That's why we passed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. This country has a great, used to anyways, legacy of cleanup, of making that air and water better. And climate change is the next thing in that evolution of public policy. It is the next commons issue that affects all of us, that without some role of the federal government, we will not be able to effectively solve. We will not.
But that is the issue. What is the role of the government?
That's
I mean,
right.
look what happened with healthcare.
That's right.
The rhetoric was, look, if you want good healthcare, go buy it.
That's right.
We want you to be free.
Right.
We want you to go buy it.
Right.
Not this idea that we're in this together, we have a responsibility toward each other, and government should work for us all.
Yeah.
That, I think, is the fundamental struggle that we're facing right now. And
right.
when the president says America first, they're carrying that through right to each person. You're on your own. And that started with Reagan. And that's when those policies really
That's right.
changed. Yeah.
Let me raise another issue that will allow us to transition to another topic that I know, Don, you wanted to talk about today. And this is the issue of race and poverty and justice. Because when these events occur, whether in South Asia or in Texas or in Florida, very often the people that suffer the most are, number one, people who have done the least to cause the problem.
Yes.
Number two, often those who are poor, who are in the lower socioeconomic stratum in the society. And often it's people of color who are affected by these disasters, these man-made, human-made disasters. And so in the literature, there's a lot of attention, in the environmental literature, a lot of attention to environmental racism.
Right.
Yes.
Where are
Yes.
toxic plants located, and on and on and on, so that the effects of pollution are felt most likely by impoverished communities, often impoverished communities of color. And the broader issue of climate justice,
Yes.
right, as we work, to address the issue of climate breakdown internationally, again, those in the global south are often the ones that are being affected first and foremost by climate breakdown, and they've had the least to do to create the problem.
Right.
And so this issue of environmental racism, or the lack of climate justice, I think is one of the important underreported stories with regard to climate change. But it also transitions us over to the discussion of race here in the United States. And of course, one of the other events that occurred while we were in between our programs here was the march that took place in Charlottesville, Virginia. And it was a march by white supremacists that were Ku Klux Klan, self-identified Nazis. The ostensible purpose for the march was to protest the taking down of the Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville, but the larger purpose obviously was to resurrect a notion of white supremacy and to basically threaten minorities and those who might be supporting them in this country. And that's why the reaction of Trump was so disappointing and caused such controversy. So Don, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about this particular issue. So,
well, several different things come to my mind. What do you think would have happened if in Ferguson, after Michael Brown was killed, the hundreds of black men showed up with arms and shields and started beating on a white man? God help us. We'd have the National Guard out there. Those guys would be shot in a minute. But that's exactly what happened in Charlottesville. And rather than outrage, we had people, especially the president, trying to make excuses and saying, well, it's not all like it looks. It is like it looks. I saw an interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates, which I thought was very impressive. One of the things he said was that, I'm not surprised at all. This is the logic of where we were going. This is, the white supremacists said, Trump is our man. We need to get him in there. He's on our side. And then he brings in the editor of Breitbart, which is the alt-right journal, to be sitting right next to him in the White House. Well, what is the logic of that? That emboldens these guys to make public what they feel in their hearts and what they're out there. And then they march through with torches through the streets. So really, I think this nation has to come to grips. We have, I believe, in this nation, accepted as the common sense, this is just the way it is. Yeah. And we have to, in a way, I think this shocked people out of this. Sort of like Birmingham did when they released the dogs and the hoses. Because when we look at any measure of quality of life, where people of color are in this country compared to white people is just outrageous. I mean, just in the city of Kalamazoo, to have more than 50, almost 60% of our kids who are African American living in poverty. And to say that that's not on the top of the agenda for what we have to do, that's acquiescence. I really think that this nation has to come to grips with its history. And how did we get to where we are? And what are we going to do about it? I go back to the Kerner Report of 1968, when the riots took place in 1967 and President Johnson set up the Governor Otto Kerner from Illinois to look at three questions. What happened? Why did it happen? And what are we going to do about it? They were very clear. The issue is white racism, which is bringing us to two different countries. And the way to fix that is a Marshall Plan for the cities, is to intervene in the cities and, in a way, it's reparations. Yeah. Put at people's hands the tools that they need to succeed. Well, we didn't do that, and we still haven't done that. But unless we do that, we're going to be facing these things time and time again. So I think it's a wake-up call for the country, and I think we have to respond to it. Now, here is a positive thing that I just learned about from Democracy Now! Thank God I watch it. In Charlottesville, before this happened, they have 5 city council members, and one of the city council members is black. And he made a motion to get rid of Lee's statue. And he lost that by 1 vote. But the city council voted to put $8 million up for the inner city where people were, to try to put in services that were going to support them and help them to self-sustaining cases. And then after Charlottesville, the city council voted to take down the statue. So there are hope there. There are cities around the country which are beginning to see that we have to invest. And the city of Kalamazoo is doing that now. This whole thing about shared prosperity is aimed at the most vulnerable people in our society, in our community, and who are overwhelmingly people of color.
Yeah, that is fantastic to hear. Kalamazoo is progressive on so many things, yet we have a huge problem. That really surprised me when I moved here 8 years ago. I do an assignment in my classes where they look up the Census Bureau. Kalamazoo has more or as much poverty as Detroit, something you might think of as
worse.
A poster child.
Statistically, we're worse. The only one worse than us is Flint.
Is Flint. Yeah. That really shocked me because that's not the Kalamazoo that I experience with my own white skin. Just let me add something to the hypothetical of Ferguson. We don't even need a hypothetical. As you know, the Dakota Access Pipeline protesters.
Right.
So you've got a group of Native Americans peacefully protesting, and how does our government treat them? Tear gas, armed weapons, out there, like they're the criminals. Such a difference, right, in the response to supposedly peaceful protest to Native Americans versus these white supremacists that were given such leverage. I think we're back to the role of government question, Don.
I think so.
The first 2 questions that you learn in political science are, what is human nature and what is the role of government? And what you were speaking to really reminded me of both. I think the race issue, as I understand it, is tied up in this notion of the other, right, from sociology, and this fundamental human nature idea of, do you consider the other a threat to your well-being and what you're able to get in this life, or do you consider the other something that could add to the quality of everybody's life? And that's a fundamental difference when we consider race. And I think people think, well, that's going to take away from what I can have. And that's just fundamentally, just like the climate change science and all these other things that we talk about, it's that underlying value, right?
It is.
That's
it really is.
very troublesome.
Underlying.
And I think another part of the problem here is the lack of ability to put things in a proper historical context.
Correct.
That's
You know,
right. Exactly.
We have this historical amnesia in this country, and so we don't really want to talk about or confront the two historic foundational crimes of our society, which of course the genocide of Native Americans by the European settlers, the settler colonialism that came after that, and of course slavery.
Yeah.
And not only did it take a bloody civil war to end slavery, but then following that, with the failure of Reconstruction, we ended up with an apartheid society, didn't we? We ended up with Jim Crow laws, legalized segregation, and look at the tremendous struggle to overcome that. And so we don't want to think about or confront these historical foundational crimes, and we don't want to then see the consequences that flow from them.
That's right.
And from a sociological perspective, I mean, sociologists would want to point to the development of historical social structures. So when we're talking about the issue of race, I always want to try to interject that we need to think about the concept of institutional racism or systemic racism. The way that racism can get built into social structures.
That's right.
And therefore the effects can continue for a long time. You don't really even need the Nazis and the KKK out there marching. Obviously they're there and that's a problem, but you can have racism without racists. If you have built into your institutional structure, into the educational system, into the economic system, on and on and on.
Absolutely.
Every major social institution, you can see the effects of those prior historical events. And therefore you can have racism continuing, its effects continuing without actual racists. Now add in, of course, the fact that there still is racism and white supremacists, and they've become more active and emboldened in our society. It only aggravates the problem. But unless we're willing to confront those historical social structures and understand how the routine operation of our society produces these consequences, we're not going to be able to make any advances. And that's why, Don, I think it's so encouraging to see what the city is doing, because it takes resources. It takes planning. It takes the ability to say, here are the consequences of institutional racism, and the only way we're going to overcome them is by making strategic investments and beginning to reverse some of the effects of those historic social structures.
Exactly. And I'm really proud of the city for doing that. I mean, we are taking this very, very seriously, and for the first time we've got some resources to deal with it. So our strategy is that we're working in 3 areas: living wage jobs, support for families, and our youth. And we've gotten together people that are working in each of those fields and asking them to tell us what's working, what are the gaps, and what do we got to do to fill the gaps. And we are taking our time. We are not just starting a program. In fact, the city doesn't want to run the programs. We have great organizations out here that are doing terrific things. We have to get a common agenda. We have to get a collective response. So we are meeting with those folks, having those folks meet with each other. We're the catalysts. We're not the ones dictating. And having people from the community at the table from the beginning. And we are developing a plan. We've hired a consulting group from Washington that works in transformative change and collective response. And they've done very well. And we are going to, by Christmas, have a plan where we're going to try to really put this into place.
That's fantastic. Again,
Very
this
hopeful.
collective focus, and the focus on process is really enlightening. Again, what governments do or don't do matters.
Absolutely.
And these policy choices matter, right? And contrast that against our federal government that denies climate change and is emboldening this racist, I mean, the same people who are in the administration are saying that that's where we want to take America, or where we want to get America back to, right?
And that's really, what's happening here is that the federal government is not doing this. Right. So cities have had to step forward with much less resources. Right. So Juan Gonzalez, who is on Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman, has just written a book called Reclaiming Gotham, Ending a Tale of Two Cities, looking at what different cities around the country are doing to try to end this disparity, the two-nation thing, the two different societies that we have in our cities.
It's very interesting because there's another book that's just been published, back to the climate change issue. It's by political scientist Ben Barber.
Yeah, Cool Cities.
And it's called Cool Cities.
Yeah.
Oh.
And Barber's point is pretty much the same thing. He says, look, the national governments, the international political community has failed to react to climate change. They haven't, even with the Paris Accord, I mean, we certainly didn't want Trump to withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Accord, but even the Paris Accord was not sufficient, right? We need more than that. It was a great first step, and we need everything that was going to be accomplished through the Paris Accord, but it still wasn't going to be enough to get us where we need to go. So even with the Paris Accord, we can still say the international political community needs to do more. The U.S. government needs to do more, and of course we're going in the opposite direction right now. But into that vacuum has stepped cities.
That's right.
Cool cities, and they're cool in two senses, right? They're cool in the sense that hey, this is a great thing to do, but they're also cool in the sense that we need to reduce global warming, right? And so cities are doing a lot of the things that need to be done that will move us in that direction. It's almost exactly the same kind of thing that you're talking about here, Don, with regard to the other issue.
And I think what we would hope to do would be to create a model here that other cities could imitate, and that could move us toward the national level, similar to what's been happening with healthcare, as some of the states are experimenting with different ways to provide healthcare for their people and then push it to the national level. That's what we have to do. But it comes back to something you said, Denise, and that is we have to see ourselves as one community, that we are all responsible for each other. And I really think that Kalamazoo has been outstanding in this, in their generosity, but also in like their reaction to like DACA the other day, when 200 people show up in the park with 24 hours notice. Tremendous.
Yeah, there's a real, I think that these are common themes. This is the world that we're living in, is reactionary to the federal government lack, inability to solve our common problems. And I don't want to, again, get too into the city thing, because we do need the federal government,
we need the federal government
as well, right?
It should be their job.
Cities can't do this on their own. No. But on the other hand, this is how democracy is supposed to work.
Exactly.
Right? And so if you're the conservative out there who thinks, no government, limited government is the way to go, well, this is how all policies that have been successful have worked. They've started at a local level. A bunch of different local communities try things out, right? And we get to some good models of what works for the most citizens, and then we can implement those at the federal level. And the federal government usually doesn't want to do, I really liked what you said, Don, about the city doesn't want to own this thing.
No.
That right there is a model of government that can be big government, but doesn't have to be the controlling government that I think everyone in the conservative side is so afraid of, right? That they're going to control every little action. No, it is mostly about the incentivizing and the institutions that you were speaking of, and what are the rules of the game, and what are we incentivizing or not. And that can be such a powerful role of government that's still not telling you what to do in your house today. It's saying, let the ideas percolate, let the free market of ideas, to steal a conservative term, ride the day. Right?
There's a problem here that I think we also need to talk about, and probably more than just the few minutes that we have left in the program today, and that is, of course, all this attention is being focused, the hurricanes and Charlottesville and North Korea, and of course, for obvious reasons, these are huge stories. These are going to demand and command our attention. But while we're focused over here on these big events, the government is operating under the new administration.
That's correct.
And because of the people that Trump has put in place in very important positions within the government, the federal government is actually very active right now, but it's active in a negative way.
Yes.
So Denise, I know you follow the EPA, so maybe just to finish it off today, we just have a few minutes left, maybe about 5 minutes, but what's happening with the EPA? Because while we're focused over here on Harvey, Scott Pruitt's very busy over here doing some very dastardly things.
That's, that's it exactly. And so, you know, a short lesson in government politics, my class is learning this right now. Even though the legislative agenda is stalled, no tax reform, no repeal and replace of Obamacare, those things aren't happening. The president has control over all those executive agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency and the National Parks in my world and Social Security and all of these agency decisions that are implemented. And, you know, my sort of tagline for how the EPA is currently being run is to make America polluted again. I mean, really. And so this morning was very sobering. I was telling Don before the show. I had to, you know, I have to come back and update my class and teach this stuff. And it's been a lot of work this year because there's so much that's going on in this executive agenda that is not getting paid attention to. But the cumulative effect of it has great impacts. And this morning I wrote down the list because I don't want to forget anything, and it was pretty sobering to write this very long list that you see in front of me, not to mention the things we talked about climate change, but instead replacing science civil servants with industry counsel on almost every board you can imagine. It's all kind of done in secret. Nobody uses their phones. You can't take notes in meetings anymore. You can't bring your cell phone anywhere. This is all happening under the radar. You know, things like opening coal leases, taking everything off the web, a total lack of information, right? One statistic, for example, environmental enforcement from the Environmental Protection Agency, the folks who are supposed to go after polluters when we know that they are the ones to pay for toxic sites, for example, under Superfund. That is down by 60% in this administration when compared to both Bush and Clinton at this time. We're not doing those. We're going to defund the agency. We've reversed a ban on pesticides. We now require a political aid to sign off on any grant or award that you might receive from the Environmental Protection. I'm telling you, the list goes on and on and on and on here. And I'll tell you what, though, the courts might be our one bastion here because the only check on that executive power is for citizens to sue that agency and say you're not actually following the laws that are in place. But so much damage can be done through executive orders and through control of the bureaucracy, even with those good laws on the books, unless we fight in court to uphold and say, no, actually, it does require that. And people are doing exactly that on climate change, was sort of to circle back. Under the National Environmental Policy Act, climate change is an effect you're supposed to be considering in government decisions. And the court just rejected a southeast pipeline for the government's failure to properly address climate change effects. So people can use those laws on the books, but that takes us as an engaged citizenry. And there's a lot that's going on that is, again, making America polluted again. Right? Our EPA administrator, I had to write down his LinkedIn profile, still has a great quote on what is he really about. He's the leading advocate against EPA's activist role. And he's the head of the agency. So that common air and water protection, which again has been a long and policy success legacy in this country, is now a leftist activist agenda that undermines everything that we've been working towards for over 40 years now. And it's sad to see it crumble in that executive way. I'll just say one last thing about that. The first chief of the Environmental Protection Agency, a guy named William Ruckelshaus.
Yeah, Ruckelshaus.
Right, appointed by Nixon. A Republican created all this stuff. We could do stuff together, people. He's actually come out, and he served again under Reagan, actually, as chief again when things got a little regulatory avoidance. And he's come out and said, you know, without the agency operating in a fishbowl, the lack of transparency and all of this regulatory decline, he says that's the real problem. And it is things like Harvey that happen. He says, well, I guess we have to wait for a natural disaster for people to realize, you know, we're not protecting your air and water anymore. And the toxic sites that Harvey has touched are a good recent example. I'm very confused because I get conflicting reports right now. Some of the environmental organizations are reporting that these toxic Superfund sites were flooded and there is something to be concerned about there, yet there's been no statement from our federal EPA as to even the status of those. So this is the kind of stuff that happens under the radar when you can control an agency, and we're paying attention to the other 15 terrible things that have happened today, right? So,
are they even investigating? Do we know if the
we have
EPA
no
is
idea.
investigating? We don't even know.
We don't even know. I said, I was watching the mayor of Houston get interviewed, and some journalist actually asked him about this. Say, hey, we're hearing all these reports about these toxic sites. Are you concerned about that? And he basically just had to say, that's the federal government. I have no idea.
Yeah.
Well, this is what the federal government's supposed to do.
So
and we have no idea.
Do they care about
That's
the people? I mean, that's the issue.
That's right.
In my field of criminology, a relatively new area is the area of state corporate crime.
Yes.
And this is just such a clear illustration of that. You're basically seeing the corporate takeover of the government bureaucracy in those areas that matter most to those corporations. So everybody can be laughing at Trump over here in his latest tweet, as long as my corporation or my industry has Scott Pruitt on our side as the head of the EPA doing our bidding, appointing us to all these critical committees and doing most of it in secret so that the public can't find out about it, so we can advance our corporate agenda, our profit goals at the expense of the public with the cooperation of the federal government itself.
That's right.
This is the very definition of state corporate crime.
Wow.
Yes. We would call it agency capture
Agency
in political
capture.
science speak,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
The Exxons control the climate agenda. My background, my family is farmers. The ag interests are controlling a current water rule, saying, you can't protect these wetlands. That's a bad idea too. And it's the same argument. Do you want to pay me now or pay me later?
Well, maybe that's a good place for us to end today with the Fram oil filter. You can pay me now or you can pay me later. We want to remind you again that on November 2nd in Kalamazoo, we will have Christian Parente on WMU's campus to be talking about many of these same issues. And his book is Tropic of Chaos. If you want to pick up a copy, read it before he arrives. I want to thank Don Cooney and Denise Keel once again for a very stimulating discussion of critical issues, and we certainly hope that we provided some alternative views for you to think about today. So thank you for joining us. We'll see you again on Critical Issues, Alternative Views.